Oh, yeah. So.
Aloha and welcome. Let me ask you all to join me today. Joining us here for the East-West Center Speaker Series, which is a recurring program to spotlight emerging developments across the region. Throughout this series, we explore environmental, demographic, political, and economic processes that are shaping the Asia-Pacific region in profound ways. Today, we're delighted to be welcomed by a visiting diplomat from the German Embassy in Washington, D.C., Alexander Taylor Fowles, where he works on Indo-Pacific affairs. Before joining the embassy, Alex served in a capacity that brought him to, I guess, understand about U.S. foreign policy. He was a transatlantic diplomatic fellow in the U.S. Department of State. So again, as a German diplomat, able to spend an opportunity in D.C., engaged in understanding, I guess, European affairs and other areas. Anyhow, prior to that, his service in D.C., he served in Berlin with as a chief of staff to the German government's Commissioner for Human Rights and Humanitarian Assistance from 2020 to 23. And between 2017 and 2020, he served as Germany's Deputy Consul General in Chengdu, China, leading the public diplomacy work as well as trade and economic affairs. So again, bringing a recent experience there in China. Before that, working at the embassy in London on issues of diplomacy, environmental, and cybersecurity. Before this foreign service, he also brings a wealth of experience from the private sector in business development, communications, and sustainability consulting. So we're really delighted, and I want to acknowledge, of course, Dennis Saleh, who's our honorary consul of Germany here in Hawaii, helping to connect us with this valuable opportunity to hear some perspectives. So let me, on that, just turn over to Alex Taylor Fowles. Thank you for joining us today. Aloha.
Aloha, and thank you very much to the East-West Center for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. As was just mentioned, I have a little bit of experience in and on the region, and I hope to sort of give a little bit of a flavor of how Germany, how Europe sort of views the Indo-Pacific and sort of where we could potentially look at working together between Germany and the US and Europe and the US. How many China hands have we got in the room? Yeah. So if I ask you what the Chinese word for China is, you will say, sorry? Middle country. That's right. What I've always found interesting about that is, I found two things interesting about that. Firstly, about how China views itself, right? But I think it also speaks more broadly to the sort of meaning of the region. If China is in the middle of the world, then the region around it is in the middle of the world also. And I think that's something that we often forget when we sort of think about and talk about the Indo-Pacific, particularly in Europe, because for the last 80 years, the transatlantic relationship has been that which has sort of shaped European and German foreign policy. And that is right, that is as it should be, but I think that there has been a move in sort of recent years in Europe to refocus on the meaning of the Indo-Pacific for our security and our prosperity. And that's sort of what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. One of the reflections of that was mentioned that I served as Deputy Consul General in Chengdu, China, on my, I think, second to last day at the consulate in China, in Chengdu in 2020. I had the unique experience of literally looking down on the closure of the American consulate. You know, that was at the time when the Chinese consulate general in Houston had been closed, and then the Chinese retaliated by closing the consulate in Chengdu. I always like to tell the story, you know, we, the German consulate, were in the high-rise building next to the American compound. On the day that the American compound was cleared out and the Chinese sort of gained access to that property, we were not allowed into our offices because the Chinese authorities said, "Oh, there's a security concern." It took them like 3 days to actually get into the property, which I thought was quite amusing. But what happened when that happened was that then Germany actually became the oldest consulate in Chengdu. The Americans were obviously the oldest. They opened in the 90s, and Germany opened as the second consulate in the early 2000s. And I think that does show that Germany has had a sort of implicit understanding of the meaning of not just China, but the Indo-Pacific more broadly. One of the questions that I often get asked both at home and in Washington, D.C., when I sort of talk about the Indo-Pacific, and we've sort of built out a little bit this role that I have and that I sort of share with some colleagues when we look at the Indo-Pacific, is why does Germany care? It's very far away. You have other stuff to be worrying about in your own backyard. Why do you care so much about the Indo-Pacific? Some of the explanation, some of the answers to that are fairly sort of straightforward. The trade and shipping routes, you know, Germany is an export economy. The fact that so much of world trade goes to the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait has direct implications on our prosperity if there is a problem in that part of the world. But the other aspects include that the absolute explosion in population in this part of the world that leads to issues around education, innovation, the cultural significance coming out of that part of the world. I myself don't have kids, but my colleagues who do have kids, they talk to me a lot about K-pop and J-pop and all of these things. I think that is something that we ignore or that we underestimate at our peril, because I think these sort of elements of soft power are really, really important. And I keep seeing on my social media algorithm, I keep seeing this interesting maps, right? And there's a world map where there's one little circle around that sort of includes India, China, and a few other countries in the region. And the caption reads, half of the world's population is inside the circle and the other half of the population is outside of this circle. And I think that tells us a lot about why this region is important to everyone who cares about security and prosperity. Now, all of these things led to Germany developing our first ever sort of strategy document. I'm a bureaucrat, so I really love strategy documents. Maybe we can talk later about something that came out of Washington, D.C. in the last few days in that area. But we produced a strategy document in 2020, our guidelines on the Indo-Pacific, and that sort of codified why the Indo-Pacific is important to us. And it went along the lines that I just described. You know, it was born out of our commitment to multilateralism, to strengthening networks around ASEAN and APEC and those other networks. But what has happened, and those guidelines remain relevant, they remain valid. But the other thing that's happened, and that sort of comes to the title of this talk today, the other thing that happened since 2020 is that we have seen in a very real way that European security and Indo-Pacific security are inherently and inextricably linked. I want to sort of zoom out briefly and state what may be the obvious, but I think it bears repeating. What happened on the 24th of February 2022 was the biggest shock to European security since the Second World War. The full-scale invasion, I should say, of Russia, of Ukraine, has completely and fundamentally reshaped European and particularly German foreign and security policy. The border, the Ukrainian border and the German border are about 500 miles away from each other. That's about the distance between San Francisco and San Diego. The distance between the capital Kiev and Berlin is about 840 miles, which is less than the width of Texas. This is a huge issue, and it cannot be overstated, the shock that gave to our systems. One of the things that happened days after the full-scale invasion, the then Chancellor of Germany declared a turning point in history, a Zeitenwende, which is one of these terms that we hope that, there are some German words that have sort of entered the English dictionary: zeitgeist, angst, all very sort of hopeful, optimistic terms. But this Zeitenwende is, a sea change, where he declared that we would be spending enormous amounts of new money on defense. The new government that came into office in May went even further in that same vein and amended our constitution to exempt defense spending from our constitutionally mandated debt brake, and to introduce a 500 billion euro special fund for military spending. These are just a couple of data points to illustrate how German security and defense policy has changed, because since the Second World War, for what I hope are obvious reasons, we've sort of been culturally quite a pacifist country. We had an army, we had a military, we spent money on defense, we have a really vibrant defense sector, but sort of culturally as a people, we were kind of like, that's a bit icky. We don't really want to deal with those things. We get cheap security from our American friends, and we don't want to have to worry about that. That has changed. That has changed very fundamentally. And this comes back to sort of what we're talking about today, that has also changed the way we view other parts of the world. The three biggest supporters for Russia in its war against Ukraine are in Asia. Russia, China, India, and North Korea. North Korea has sent about 12,000 troops to fight in Ukraine. India buys enormous amounts of Russian oil. China also buys oil, does also exports all sorts of dual-use equipment. China and Russia together buy about 85% of Russian oil exports, and Russia's oil revenue accounts for estimates vary, but between 30 to 50% of all of state revenue comes from oil. So I think it's no exaggeration to say that without these supporters in Asia, the war would be looking very, very different. And that is a huge problem, right? As I mentioned, Ukraine is incredibly close. It's not part of the European Union, but it's part of our European family. And this support directly affects European security, affects our homeland, and that is one of the prisms through which we view the Indo-Pacific now, and particularly the actors that I just mentioned. Our foreign minister, the German foreign minister, finished his first trip to China yesterday, as it happens. So this is a very timely conversation to be having. And one of his core messages was, yes, China, you are an important partner for us, but as long as you are actively supporting a challenge to European security, we cannot have normal relations. This is not something where we can just sort of resume the status quo. And these kinds of messages, I think, illustrates just how serious this is for us. So that's, I think, one side of the coin, right? What happens in the Indo-Pacific affects what happens in Europe. But the other way round, and that's something that I spend a lot of my time working on, what Germany and European presence in the Indo-Pacific can mean for security there. And I want to sort of give you a couple of illustrations of what that looks like. So I want to say a couple of things about the sort of military presence overall, talk a little bit about North Korea, and a little bit about the Pacific Islands. And the elephant, and these are, as I say, just a couple of examples, and we can talk about others. The elephant in the room above all of that, of course, is China, and in particular, Taiwan. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, particularly with, as I mentioned, the sort of US national security strategy that came out that sort of poses some questions about the implications there. Now, I wanted to say a couple of words about sort of Germany's in particular military presence in the Indo-Pacific. Unlike the United Kingdom and France, we don't have any territory in the Indo-Pacific. And to be perfectly candid, I think it would be an exaggeration to say that we are a military player in Asia. We're not, right? We do, however, do things that we think are in our interest. Most recently and most prominently, we did a sort of Indo-Pacific deployment where we sent a frigate, which was basically on the road for about a year, that sort of did a couple of joint exercises with Canada and the US, and then it went over to the Pacific. Did FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations in the Pacific, went through the Taiwan Strait. And if you have questions about what reactions came there, then I can answer those also. And I think in spite of the fact, and that's sort of a lot of the conversations that we have at a sort of government to government level about how useful that is, and whether our resources aren't better spent in Europe, and our response is twofold, right? So the first answer to it is we have interest in the Indo-Pacific. As I just said, we're an exporting nation. We have an inherent interest to our long-term prosperity about keeping waterways and shipping routes clear. But the other reason is that we have many other allies and partners in the region that ask us to be there. We have our close friends and partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and even though we might not be sending a full frigate sort of as part of our deployment next year through the Indo-Pacific, we will participate in about 15 other joint exercises, not just with the United States. That's important to recognize. You know, we're doing RIMPAC and all of this kind of stuff that you're going to be familiar with living in this part of the world. But, you know, we do joint exercises with Japan, with India, with South Korea, with Australia. And that is something that we also need to remember ourselves, that we have many allies and partners in the region that think it is important to message and to signal to potential adversaries in the region that this isn't sort of that this isn't just a regional issue or an American issue. And that is, I think, one of the, you know, if I wanted you to take away sort of one key message from today, it is that there is an extent to which, even if in the event of, heaven forbid, there being a sort of kinetic event in the region, that we might not be sort of militarily in terms of our hardware particularly impactful, but the fact that we are showing now that this is something that is of interest to us, of like an inherent interest to our security and prosperity, I think is a value in itself. We do, however, have some expertise in areas that are relevant in the region, and I'm just going to mention a couple of them. For example, undersea cables and securing sort of maritime infrastructure is something that we have a little bit of knowledge about from the Cold War days and that have returned now. And even though the Baltic Sea and the North Sea are very, very different sort of geographical and sort of political issues to the Pacific, I think there are some things that we can bring in terms of our expertise. One of the sort of specific areas that we work on, again, and this is I think something where sharing experience and comparing notes is something that is you know, of advantage to both of us, and this is a bit of a something for connoisseurs, but bear with me. There are various different multilateral formats in which we implement North Korea sanctions and monitor North Korea sanctions, which obviously a lot of which is happening in East and Northeast Asia. And Germany is a part of, I think, all of those multilateral formats, some of which are led by the United States, some of which are led by South Korea. There is something called the Pacific Security Maritime Exchange, which is basically the sort of technical name for one of those formats in which sanctions are monitored and implemented. And there are many things that are very, very similar to the things that we are experiencing in Europe. So there is a lot of stuff about shadow fleets and how shadow fleets operate when circumventing sanctions, things that we know from Russian sanctions circumvention. And I'm just going to mention a couple of them because completely honestly, I participated in one of these formats for the first time in September, and a lot of this was new to me as well. And I was like, oh, that's so good and interesting and encouraging that we have this experience. So, for example, the way that countries like North Korea and Russia evade sanctions is by basically manipulating monitoring systems for ships. One of the ways in which they do this is that they use either fake flags. So there was one example of a North Korean ship that used the flag of a Dutch overseas territory that doesn't have flags. It doesn't flag ships, but they put a flag on it anyway, so to sort of bamboozle everybody who was trying to monitor that. What they do more often, and this is something that the Russians and the North Koreans have in common, what they do more often is that they go to states that have so-called open flag registries. So normally, sort of most of our countries will say, this is a ship from our country, and we will give it a flag, and that's the end of it. There are lots of countries that use it as a source of revenue and say anyone can just come, pay us money, and we'll give it the flag from our country. And so the Russians and the North Koreans go to many of those countries and without any sort of explanation or monitoring, because they don't have the capacity to do that, and they say they just give the money, and then they have the flag of country X. And so we have quite a lot of experience of outreach to those countries with open flag registries, and sort of sensitizing them, building up capacity and training obviously we can't stop them from doing that. That's a sovereign decision, what you do with your flag registry, but just to sort of sensitize it that they might be in violation of UN sanctions if they do this, right? So that's something that we have brought into these sort of like sanctions monitoring formats. The other thing is something called geospoofing. So every ship is supposed to have a sort of electronic monitoring system that is also that they can also manipulate, and so they sort of send out signals saying that they're actually somewhere completely different to where the ship actually is, and that's something that we have some experience with as well, sort of like comparing like geo data and location data and things like that, and monitoring ship to ship transfers. So a lot of the sanction evasion is around oil exports, and normally though that is loaded onto the ship in harbour, it is transported, then loaded off the ship in the other harbour. But obviously that is difficult if you're under sanctions, and so there are all sorts of ways in which these states that are under sanctions offload their oil onto another ship on sea, which is actually quite difficult to do and not allowed. And so we have some experience in that and how to monitor that and how to sort of prevent that from happening. All of these are just, like I say, this is quite technical, but I got quite nerdy about this and thought this was super interesting. But all of this is just to say that even though we might not be a big sort of military player in terms of hardware in the Pacific, there is a lot that we can and do bring to various issues in the region. Now, I mentioned that the elephant in the room above all of these things is China, and I think this is not something that's particularly revolutionary when I say that the biggest security challenge in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, is securing Taiwan. and not allowing for any unilateral changes to the current status quo, which is, I think, the policy that we all share. That is why, and might go into more detail about the national security strategy that the US published. But I think one of the things that I did take away from that is that when it comes to security in Asia from the US's point of view, there is an even more singular focus, if we can say that, on defending Taiwan and the integrity of the first island chain. And that is an interest that I think we all share. As I say, sort of the stated policy goal is no unilateral changes to the current status quo. And that is, I think, something that is important that all like-minded countries that have an interest in maintaining peace and stability in the region can and should work on. I'm going to mention another strategy document because, as I say, I'm a bureaucrat, so I love them. In 2022, Germany published its China strategy. And because I said China is the big elephant in the room when it comes to Indo-Pacific security, I'm going to say a couple of words about that. For several years, we talked about China. We had a sort of a triangle of analytical ways we thought about China. China is a partner, China is a competitor, and China is a strategic rival. And for several years, we sort of saw these three aspects, these three sort of analytical ways of looking at China as being sort of relatively on equal footing. That has changed. And this is like sort of this is how the new German government thinks about it. The aspect of strategic rivalry has become the dominating way in which China deals with us and deals with Europe and deals with the West, if we still want to use that term. And that is because of Chinese activity. That's because of the way that the Chinese are starting to behave, or continuing to behave, but behaving a lot more assertively in the international arena. And that has implications for our policy. So one of the big sort of narrative in this China strategy that came out is de-risk, right? We've talked about this for a long time. Some people would prefer us to decouple or strategically decouple or whatever, but our approach is to de-risk. So not detach from China, but to basically reduce existential dependencies, because we saw how terrible that can be in the case of Russia, when, cheap energy that we relied on for many years was no longer forthcoming. And this has all sorts of implications for how we look at Chinese activity in the Indo-Pacific and then what we do on that. Now, again, if we're thinking in terms of scenarios and a blockade or invasion scenario, I think it's safe to say that the hardware that Germany or other European countries would send would probably be not so significant as to be decisive. And so the things that we think and talk about quite a lot are what other things would need to be done, and we can take a little bit of insight from how the international response was to Russia's war against the Ukraine. And a lot of that is then going to be about economic and financial measures. And I can't sort of go into too much detail, but that is something that we can and are thinking about. One of the things that is particularly uncomfortable for Germany that's sort of been happening more and more recently is that China has been sort of saying, well, China was always very supportive of German reunification. Why is Germany not supportive of Chinese reunification? I think if we go off the record, I can tell you about what obviously how flawed that comparison is in many ways. But some of the other things that we can and do when it comes to Taiwan is supporting what everyone started to call sort of resilience efforts, right? The Taiwanese administration talks about all of society resilience, and that is something that we do actually have a lot of expertise in. We have quite a lot. Germany in particular has quite a lot of technical expertise when it comes to sort of disaster preparedness and sort of like the structure, that both the technical and the sort of structural governance issues around that. So we are massively expanding that. And I think that's crucial, working with other allies and partners on that, because I think we often have the problem, and that's same in the Pacific Islands, we often have the problem that we sort of all kind of go in and do the same thing, and then we have like big gaps that no one's sort of working on, and that's something that we're really working on together, also with the US presence there. I'm going to sort of close my remarks with a couple of thoughts on the some more recent developments and sort of Chinese policy towards all of us. So you all followed the sort of escalation and de-escalation over the last few months around export controls on critical minerals and rare earths. And I think we can't talk about and we can't think about security issues without looking at those economic security issues, because they are all interlinked, and Chinese activity links them heavily together as well. And so many of the conversations that we Europeans, Germans have had with the US administration over the last few months is that this is a new era now in how we look at China, because they have shown that they are willing to, that they have this weapon of, massive dependency of the rest of the world on them for a particular thing, and they are willing to use it, right? So one of the things that our counterparts say is China has pointed a loaded gun at the world economy, and they are willing to use it. And that is, I think, something that is an economic but also a security issue on which we must work together. And so joint de-risking together, working with allies and partners on securing and making those supply chains more, giving them more integrity. And I think this is a really, really crucial thing that sort of I'm spending a lot more of my time thinking about is, okay, we've identified this one choke point. We've identified this one weapon that the Chinese have. What are the others? What are the other choke points that are coming? One of the things that we talk about quite a lot is pharmaceutical APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, where China holds a similar sort of monopoly on the world supply chain. But there are others as well around battery technology, around quantum computing, and around semiconductors. And so from all of that, we conclude that those are things that we can really only do together. And I think I'm not saying anything too controversial when I say that American foreign policy over the last few months has moved more in the direction of not overly engaging too heavily with allies and partners on such strategic matters, and that we believe that there are really, really important issues like the ones I've just outlined where that cooperation is essential. It's sort of end on a sort of slightly happier note. I think what we do in our what sort of I do in my job as a diplomat is sort of think about sort of what's really behind something. And so in spite of what I just said about American foreign policy being maybe a little bit more unilateral, I think behind some of that rhetoric, there is a lot of very serious discussion around how and where to engage from a perspective of what are our interests and what interests do we have in common. And I think that security in the Indo-Pacific, which includes economic security, human security, and those other issues, that is one of those areas where I think we all acknowledge and we all see that is something that we can only do together. And I think maybe just like one last thing, America can't win the strategic competition with China by itself. America needs allies and partners. America needs us. We need America. And that is, I think, actually a positive agenda that we can work on together and shape the future of a sort of strong and stable, some might say free and open, Indo-Pacific. So that's sort of broad brush overview over sort of the way we're thinking about the relationship, but I'm also happy to talk about, happy to sort of hear your perspectives and answer any questions. I sort of skipped over what I was going to say because I was going on for too long about some of the stuff that we're doing with the Pacific Island states, which I think is something that's very, very interesting for this part of the world. So if you have any questions or comments on that, then I'd be happy to go into more detail on that. But I also want to give space for a conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and we will have this opportunity to open. I'm very, grateful you've opened up a lot of food for thought. So, what I'd like to make clear, we do have some folks online, and so we're going to go back and forth. And let me just remind our folks that are here, in order to ask a question, you'll want to click on the mic that's in front of you. You hit the button, and you'll see a little light activate like this. That's good. That means it's hot, and you can speak. And then when you finish, just click it again. As well, since we have folks from different areas, I would ask that you just briefly introduce yourself, tell us where you come from. I want to use my opportunity just to maybe ask you to say, even if it's a brief synopsis of what you just finished, the engagement with the Pacific Islands, and then from there, we'll open it for more. But again, just a brief synopsis, if you could.
Yeah, so I think the Pacific Islands is one of the outflows of that Indo-Pacific strategy that I mentioned. That is something that we have overlooked, I think, for many years. The United States hasn't, for historical and geographical reasons, right? But one of the ways in which we sort of entered that space is, and this is not a very sexy term at the moment, but climate change. So one of the ways in which we started expanding our cooperation massively with the Pacific Islands was on climate resilience. We call it something else now. We call it sort of infrastructure resilience or energy resilience, but it's all the same stuff. And so that was our starting point with many of those countries because of rising sea levels and natural disasters and everything that is affecting those countries very heavily. But I think what's important is that I said slightly facetiously, we call it something else now. But the reason that we call it something else is that there is an acknowledgement also in the way we do our programming, is that it's also about security, right? Like those things, these things are interlinked. And so we call it climate security, but it is a security issue. It links into things like food security. Right, and those are areas in which we've invested quite a lot of money through some of our development agencies in those kind of like resilience efforts. Some of the other things that might sound a bit more fluffy, but I think are not insignificant, are things around cultural preservation. So we've been working, and this is very delicate, right? And I don't think there's a really good answer to it. But if you start from a point of view that some of these lands are not going to be around forever, how do you preserve the cultural heritage in those places when the land sort of becomes less inhabitable or becomes less arable or whatever it is? And so we've actually, when I was sort of preparing this, I was looking at some of the projects that we do in sort of that cultural preservation field, and that's because that's a very new field, right? How do you preserve people's culture, people's history, if their territory is disappearing? And so that's another thing that I think is very good. And then there's sort of things like that excite me as a diplomat. You know, we opened up a new embassy in Fiji, which is again, like it is an important sort of symbol and an important signal. We have been engaging a lot more heavily with the Pacific Island Forum and have committed, I think, €7 million in sort of a first tranche into various efforts through the forum, and things like that. And once again, I think I don't want to overstate this, but I'm a self-avowed China hawk, so I'm going to do it anyway. We do a lot of these things because they are valuable and because we have partners in the region that for whom this is valuable. But at the same time, it's not because of this, but at the same time, it also helps bolster against sort of Chinese malign influence in the region. That's not the reason we're doing it, but it's an added bonus. And I think when we talk about these things all being linked to security issues, I think that's important to remember as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me open it now, and in turn, we have our first question here from Andreas. Try again, yeah. Maybe on the right side. There you go. Okay.
Hello, I'm Andreas Forsby, Senior Researcher at Danish Institute for International Studies in Copenhagen. So thank you for an excellent presentation. There were a lot of things I would like to comment, but maybe I'll just leave it at a couple of things. And I think the first one that really interested me was that you just briefly mentioned the new NSS from the US, and you seem to suggest that there was maybe not that much news when it came to the Taiwan issue. And actually, even there, I was quite amazed about the way they talk about Taiwan now. So, for instance, just this one passage in which you usually would have the US administration say, we oppose any unilateral change to the status quo. There they changed the terminology. Now it says something along the lines of, we do not support any unilateral changes to the status quo. I found that to be a significant change after all. So many other things stands out. I mean, it's created so much consternation in Europe, obviously. With regards to China, I mean, China wasn't mentioned until page 19. It's not been explicitly targeted in terms of all those traditional issues that the US would be concerned about. So, I mean, they do mention some of these issues, but they're not targeting China directly, which is quite amazing, I would say. They don't even mention China's military modernization, build-up of nuclear arms, its support for Russia in the strategic relationship with Russia, and its support, you mentioned dual-use items and all that. It's not at all there in the NSS. Quite amazing to me. So that's what I would like to hear your thoughts about it, and especially, of course, from a European, a German perspective, how they see this NSS. The other thing, sorry, is that you mentioned the Zeitenwende, and you linked that to the war in Ukraine. Of course, that was also a Zeitenwende in Denmark. But there's been another Zeitenwende in Denmark, and that happened when the new Trump administration took office earlier this year. And from a Danish perspective, it's also, about not just the Greenland question. We have Trump coming out several times saying we will get it one way or the other, as he told the US Congress in March. But it's also about our deep dependence on the US in so many ways, technologically, militarily, economically. I mean, the US being our largest trading partner, the largest investor, FDI terms in Denmark and all that. So I guess I also wanted to hear about how you see it from a German perspective. I mean, you're maybe even more dependent on the US in terms of these things I talked about here than Denmark. So has that also created this kind of Zeitenwende moment, or how do you see it? So those two questions. Thank you so much.
So the reason I got up my phone is that we did just receive some sort of lines to take on the national defense strategy, and so I can't be too forward-leaning on sort of what my personal views are. I think what I will say is that we are, I think we Germany and we Europeans are concerned about some of the statements that were made about Europe. And we have a very clear diverging opinion about this, and that sort of support for what we consider dangerously far right parties and movements is something that is a problem for us, because it also constitutes sort of interfering in our internal affairs and our democratic processes. So that is a problem, right? That is something that we address and do address, and sort of say to our American friends that that's not something that we can accept. Same goes for their analysis of civilizational danger to Europe through mass migration, right? You know, Denmark, Germany, all of our countries have very lively political and public debates around the effects of migration, and I think a lot has happened in the last few years to sort of regulate it more strongly and reduce unregulated, we call it unregulated, uncontrolled migration, and I think we've done quite well on that. So again, we have a different point of view on that. On the sort of more hardline security aspects, so this is my personal view. Looking at it from as a bureaucrat myself, and who's been sort of tangentially involved in strategies that we've written ourselves, I think it's clear, and this is not sort of a criticism, this is just the way it is, right? That these documents have to reflect a very broad range of views from within an administration. It clearly reflects the views of different parts of the interagency, and sort of people with different points of view. And I think that's not an abnormal thing. I think that's very normal. But I think it does lead to maybe things where we have questions around consistency. So I personally wouldn't sort of place too much emphasis on what I would consider details in the language, because I don't know where it's come from. I would be hesitant to read too much into things like that, because I think what's become clear is that you know, in English we say, sort of in England we say, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and so I think we can glean some things from this document, but I think I wouldn't place too much stock on the sort of details in phrasing, is what I'd say about that, because I mean, and that is why sort of in my remarks I sort of said there is a level of consistency when it comes to Taiwan and the first island chain. I think there are some things conspicuous by their absence, right? I think the fact that North Korea isn't mentioned is significant. I think that the way that India is dealt with is significant, and then but we'll have to see, right? We'll have to see how this is reflected then in concrete actions of the administration in the region, and I think that is, it's not, we don't know, right? And you know, there are other things that are coming. The national defense strategy is coming, we hear, in the next days, and we don't know what's happening in terms of the defense posture review, because I think that is, I think, particularly when it comes to sort of US security commitment, I think that is probably actually the more significant thing, because they can write these things that make us Europeans a little bit exercised about how they sort of view our domestic affairs, but when it comes to sort of like the security issues, is are they actually going to withdraw a lot of troops or sort of wind down their troop presence? I don't know. And I think that will be the more significant thing when it comes to sort of our conclusions. And your second question was?
You get back on the Taiwan thing. Yeah, it was more Germany's response to the way. I mean, you've been so dependent on the US that we have been in Denmark.
Yeah,
and we are. So today, actually today, we are 11 times behind there. Today, we had the annual threat assessment strategy from Danish Defense Intelligence Service. For the first time ever, they mentioned our dependence on US technology and economic reliance as well. You know, we've never mentioned the US in the Danish national threats.
Yeah.
So that goes some way to.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's let me say this. In the lines to take that I just had a quick look at for the national defense, for the national security strategy, the one of the core messages, and I said that slightly facetiously, one of the core principles of what we do every day in our embassy and our consulates is no matter what, the United States is still like our most important partner when it comes to sort of economic and security affairs. And I mean, this is not a big secret, right? Like we in Europe are massively dependent on the United States for security, and we have, and this is something that we say, you know, with all due modesty, right? Like it's we have been relying on the US for too long, and we were reaping the benefits of not having to invest in our own defense to the extent that we needed to. For many years, right? And so now we need to undertake these Herculean efforts, both financially and socially, to sort of compensate for years of underinvestment in this field, right? And so I think that is something that we are aware of, and we, particularly Germany, I mean, we're the third or fourth biggest economy in the world, and we're the biggest economy in Europe, and we haven't done enough, right? It's entirely clear that we haven't, so that's how I would frame it. There are some in my country that would sort of say, oh, we need to become less reliant and less dependent on the US. But I mean, fair enough, right? Maybe just one sort of like little historical excursion. We in Germany, and in the German media in particular, I think we focus a lot on President Trump and as the person. I think it's easy to forget that successive US administrations since the 1990s have been saying you all need to do more on defense. The 2% target for NATO was a Barack Obama thing, because Barack Obama came into office and he came to the summit in Wales in 2014, was it? The NATO summit in 2014, and said the American people are no longer willing to sort out your all's defense. You all need to do more, and that's where the 2% target came from. And so I think it's important to remember that this is not a uniquely Republican or Trump or whatever. This is a trend that has been coming out of the US for many years. And again, I say, fair enough. I mean, I think we'd all be happier if everyone who's not an American, would all be happier if this just went on forever and ever. But I also understand the argument that there are many things that American administrations feel are a greater priority domestically that they need to address, and spending quite so much money on defending countries that at least financially could do it themselves, I think is probably fair enough. Having said that, I'll just one little additional comment. Having said that, it is of course, and I think this comes back to sort of what I sort of tried to describe earlier. It is not like it's not in America's interest to have sort of like a stable and peaceful Europe, right? There's like the Marshall Plan, for example, was a lot of US money spent in Europe, but that was in the US's interest, because otherwise you had the Soviet Union that would have taken over the entire continent, and that was definitely not in the US's interest, and it's definitely not in the US's interests to withdraw now and to have Russia roll across the continent, because that's what they want, right? We know that that's what they want. This is not a big state secret. We know, Putin has told us that this is what he wants to do, and so that is not in the United States' interest. We need to do more, but it's not in the US's interest either.
We may have time for one more question from our audience, and we'll bring the formal talk to a close. I know we'll have an opportunity even after to interact more informally, but let me reach out if anybody is here with a question to follow. Let's start here, Ambassador.
Yeah, hi, Jim Moriarty, former diplomat, 9 years in South Asia, 5 years in Taiwan, 5 years in Beijing, 2.5 years at the NSC, and then chairman of AIT for 7 years. And what I see in this document is, I'm going to force you to talk about the national security strategy a little bit, is a whole lot of continuity, which you expect to see because US interests don't change that rapidly. What was most surprising to me in this document was talk about how we need to work with the Europeans on confronting basically Chinese trade and industrial policy. That's a huge change.
Yeah.
You know, basically, and if I looked at that, that is what I would be grabbing and running. We have a consensus on one of the two biggest issues facing Europe, along with support for Russia by China, is of course subsidized exports to Europe. And it's huge for us, it's huge for the world. If we can get together on that, we can perhaps force change in Chinese policy. What we're talking about is deterrence. How do we stop this all blowing up? And we do that by cooperating in important areas where we have enough leverage to perhaps change Chinese behavior. And trade and investment, I think, is one where we might. And that's a question, I guess. Do you agree with that, or?
I mean, I can give a really short answer. Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I mean, okay, yes. I think that's exactly right. And I think that goes to sort of my earlier point that I tried to make, that this is not something that the US or any European country can do by itself, right? I think the analysis is exactly right, that Chinese overcapacity is actually, along with export controls on rare earths and critical minerals, I think those two together are probably the biggest threat to prosperity in the rest of the world. Because the subsidized exports, the overcapacity, and that is at the core of the Chinese economic model, right? This is the problem. This is not a bug. This is a feature. And it does require, I mean, maybe the US could manage to change Chinese behavior by itself. I'm not sure, but it is for sure necessary to do it together. And because going to China and sort of doing high-level diplomacy, and I don't just mean the US, right? Like I say, my foreign minister was just there, and just saying, please stop, is not going to cut it, right? That's not where China is. And I think the way that China has put itself at the center of the spider's web of international trade and has made everyone so dependent on it, again, is a feature, not a bug. That is they have done this with great deliberateness since joining the sort of like international trading system in the early 2000s. And untangling that is a huge challenge, and one that can only be met if we do it together. And I'm gonna say, in spite of much of the rhetoric coming out of Washington DC, there is a lot of serious work going on in that respect. So I'm again there cautiously optimistic that we'll get there, but it is something that we do need to do with great economy, right? Like it's not something that can wait.
Well, thank you all. I apologize. We're going to have to bring closure to the formal part, but again, we will continue an opportunity to more informally chat with our guests. I mean, thank you, Alex, for the opportunity.
Sorry, I have a tendency to not be short in my answers. I apologize.
No, but we're grateful again engaging us in this dialogue. And as you come to learn about the center, of course, we stand ready here to help support any continued engagement from Germany. We get support from various governments throughout the region, and look forward to maybe ways to bring you and your teams back here. Let me close on that and just remind everybody, first, thank you for attending, but there is a YouTube recording of this that'll be posted and shared on our channel in case you wish to share it with others who couldn't make it here. Also thanking, we have many from the audience online, and we weren't able to get to some of their questions, but I'll share those with you. Lastly, I just want to make sure everybody's aware, we part of our research speaker series, we do have one exactly 23 hours from today here tomorrow. We're joined by a guest speaker, Joel Witt of the Stimson Center Center in Washington. He's an expert on North Korea. We're giving us a talk on how America failed to disarm North Korea and the lessons for the future. So on that, thank you again for joining us, and look forward to you at our next speaker series talk.
Thank you so
Aloha.
much.